We're focusing now on what until recent months has been the most dynamic sub-regional organization in modern Arab history, namely the Gulf Cooperation Council, established May 25th, 1981. And in the shadows of death on their doorstep with regard to the war between Iran and Iraq, which lasted 8 years. And so when the GCC came into existence, many people from outside the region subjected it to ridicule and dismissal because they had looked at so many previous attempts at Arab regional cooperation, integration, unity. Those words are important, and because so many had not worked out or even gotten off the table beyond the rhetoric, their sights were deliberately lower in order to be more realistic, practical, and feasible in their reach. And so the key word was and has been all along cooperation. Of course, the goal in their first agreement, the Economic Unity Agreement of June 6, 1981, just 2.5 weeks after GCC was established, people misinterpreted that. They saw the word unity in it and said, wait a minute. They couldn't be less united, and the prospects for them to be united are remote. But that agreement was more a blueprint, a framework for reference for how they might formulate their development plans from then forward so as to have less duplication, less waste, less competition, at least of the harmful kind. And they have indeed established far more than any other previous sub-regional Arab organization in modern Arab history. It has its share of detractors, and they outnumber its supporters or boosters, or those who would say something positive about it. But here we try to ask that all step back, try to be detached, analytical, clinical, and objective, and fair to reality. This collectivity of 6 entities, and Ambassador Zahra is immediate past ambassador to one of the member countries, worked closely with the United States to bring about a unanimous resolution, July 15th, 1987, of the United Nations Security Council calling for a ceasefire in the Iran-Iraq war. Iraq accepted it immediately. Iran took 13 months, and that was directly responsible for more death and maimed human beings. We could not have done that, we, the United States. 15 votes in the UN Security Council. The last previous time something like that had happened, 15 out of 15, was during the Korean War. Well, actually, that wasn't 15 out of 15, that was 14. And the Soviet ambassador had gone to the bathroom, and that's when they voted. And he'd never been to the bathroom since. And you can see it, I think, the effects thereof. So that was quite a feat, but it was the GCC countries that brought the non-permanent members, the 10, to the table. Secondly, they worked with the United States and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan to bring about the end of the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. And in so doing that drove the last nail in the coffin of the international communism and the Red Army. And the Soviet Union imploded shortly thereafter. We could not have done it alone. We did it with them, through them, by them. And thirdly, working together, they prevented the Iranian Revolution from expanding to the western shores of the Gulf. Give credit where credit is due. working together, those were accomplishments of no small moment. Now we have 4 speakers and 2 commentators, and I've asked them to try to be as succinct, effective, forthright, and commentary as possible, and to please recommend steps forward to improve the existing situation. Our first speaker is Dr. Mohammed Alsulami. I had not met him until he came to this conference there, but he's had an important task and role, and let's listen to his perspective. He's working on Arab-Iranian issues from Riyadh. Dr. Sulami.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to participate in this conference, and many thanks to the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations, and special thanks to Dr. John Anthony for inviting me. Since the organizer, and because of my specialty, I will talk about the Arab-Iranian relationships, and it is about the Iranian sectarian geopolitical project in the region generally, with every means of constitutional facts and factual evidence. But before that, it is important to mention that Iran is our neighbor. We share history, culture, geography, and religion with them. And that is a reality we cannot change. Let's start with shedding light on Iranian Constitution. It is very important to look at the Iranian Constitution to understand the Iranian role in the region. In Article 154 of the Iranian Constitution said that Iran considers the independence, freedom, and the establishment of law and justice government are a prerogative of all people around the world. And therefore, the Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran supports the legitimate struggle of the oppressed against oppressors in the whole world. Here, since we in the United States, and let's imagine that Canada or Mexico becomes a revolutionary country with a hegemonic project, what will be the American react look like? That is our situation in the region when we are dealing with the Iranian project. So the Yemen case is an excellent example of that. We are talking about Iran here, and Iran has sent all type of weapons to the Houthis to kill Yemenis and to fire the ballistic missiles towards Saudi Arabia in the border areas and all the way to Mecca. Another paragraph, our article is the paragraph 5 of Article 2 of Iranian Constitution, which is another important paragraph we need to deal with. This paragraph says that belief in the imama, which is the belief, the Jafari principle, and continuous leadership is an essential base for the revolution's continuity. Allows me here to wonder, isn't this text an express provisions that gives Iran the right to interfere in the other countries' internal affairs? It is a continuous revolution. It is not limited to the Iranian borders. Article 12 said that the official religion of Iran is the Islam in 12th school, or Jafari. And this article cannot be changed. This is a sectarian article that defines Iran as a sectarian country by definition, excluding Iranians inside, leave alone outside. The Sunnis, the Christian, Jews, Zaradushtans, you call them, they are not considered to be Iranians. So therefore, the problem is not our or Sunni Shia problem. It is the ideology that leads the Iran and rules the Iranian government. The cries and disturbance in the region are clear evidence of the Khomeini legacy of Shia geopolitics that seeks general strategic policies drawn up the Iranian regime decision makers, who are fully aware of the sectarian, historical, and pragmatic dimensions of this area. The Iranian leadership has been working on geographic expansions to promote Iranian interest in the targeted countries and to shape what's called the Shia crescent. And this can be achieved through encouraging Shia minorities in the region to revolt against local government by politicizing and militarizing the Shia in countries like Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, and other places. So where does this come from? The Shia geopolitical strategy resulted from the Iranian leadership's fifth improvement plan of the year 2003 within the framework of the 20-year pact, which aims to establish Iran as a major regional power by 2025. So that's this 50-year plan of penetration will see Iran aspire for the all expansions of Shias in the Arab world and Islamic countries. The close Iranian relationship with the terrorist groups is not fiction or political speculations. It is a reality, and we have all the evidence of the relation between Iran and ISIS and Iran and Al-Qaeda before that. And what happens in Iraq, for example, when ISIS attacks Sunni cities like Fallujah, Anbar, Ramadi, and others, is a really pure fact of how ISIS deals with the issues inside Iraq. So let's consider this for a moment. The conclusion that can be drawn is, yes, Iran is the only beneficiary of the ISIS behavior in the region. Today, Iran, with its ballistic missiles, threatens international peace and advances their track record of terrorism and terrorist operations by targeting diplomatic missions and diplomats. United States was the first country which was attacked. I mean, their embassy in Tehran, 1979, Saudi embassy in 1987, Saudi embassy again in 2006, the British, French embassies, and the assassination of many diplomats, whether inside and outside Iran. The aforementioned Iranian expansions projects, sectarian schemes, and the terrorist operations have been mandated to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, IRGC. And its main corps, namely the Quds forces, and its problematic leader, Qasem Soleimani, who goes all the way from Iraq, border Iraq and Syria, and without any fears of any international, following, for example, for the international coalition against ISIS. So he's just going freely from one city to another. By the way of conclusion, yesterday some speakers stressed the necessity of rebuilding countries like Iraq and Syria, which is very important, I guess, and everybody would agree with that. But before rebuilding the countries, we have to stop the tools of demolishing countries. So that is, you cannot build while there is somebody demolishing and destroying the countries. So the key priority for GCC countries and the region's safety is to order Iranian behavior and to deter Iranian behavior, and that requires linking the nuclear deal with the ballistic missile programs and interference in the affairs of other Arab countries or regional countries' internal affairs, and the handcuff of Iran, IRGC, and its affiliated militias, as well as coping with the terrorist organizations of mutual interest like ISIS. In other words, the issue of Iranian regime cannot be limited to the nuclear program, though it is important, but more to the Iranian behavior in the region and beyond that. Otherwise, any deal with Iran will be a failure diplomacy, and it was the case of the nuclear deal of 2005 is a very good example of that. It didn't stop Iranian behavior in the region, but in the other, Iran see that deal as a green line for become more aggressive in the region. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for being succinct and keeping within a limited time schedule. We next turn to Dr. Abdullah Baabood, who has a checkered record of achievements there. He's been closely involved with the Gulf Research meetings held annually in the University of Cambridge, the United Kingdom. There is no annual summer convention that draws more specialists on Arabia and the Gulf to deliberate for the better part of 4 days and a dozen or more workshops talking about diversification of economies. He's been involved with the diversification of analysis and description with regard to substance of the realities of this particular region. He's also the founder and the director of the world's only PhD program in Gulf Studies at Qatar University. Please welcome Dr. Abdullah Baabood.
Thank you, John Duke, for this introduction, and I want to echo my previous speakers and colleagues to thank you for the kind invitation and to thank your capable team for organizing this very important meeting. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be talking about the GCC states and their role in the region. And I see many of you here with gray hair and maybe some without hair, like me. And you don't remember the Gulf, especially the young generation, when it was backwater, impoverished, very quiet region. And now, for those of you who've been to the Gulf, you will see that is no longer the case. The Gulf has evolved, has changed, has transformed into a very modern region. Thanks in large part to the energy wealth that was found there and to the exports of that energy globally and to the revenues that have been used to develop the region. Now, with that a little introduction, the Gulf states were basically very vulnerable. As my previous speaker has mentioned, there is, of course, a threat from Iran, and John Duke has also talked about the invasion of then the Soviet Union to Afghanistan, the conflicts around them. So these Gulf states started to get together and formed what is known as the Gulf Cooperation Council. The acronym is the GCC. The GCC, as also John Duke had explained, has achieved a number of goals. Of course, it set for itself a very large and very ambitious goal. And it has so far achieved quite a lot. And we should applaud it for what it has achieved. Some of its achievement, of course, is the custom union, the common market, linking all the GCC together, the security agreement that has been signed, and the rail project, the electricity network, and all of those achievements that basically help to get the people together, because the people of the Gulf states are basically the same people, having and sharing the same culture and the same destiny. And they wanted to work together to establish a regional organization that can not only protect their security, but also see their ambition being fulfilled. That has been achieved of course, it took some time. There was a lot of shortfalls. Their expectations were high, but nevertheless, there was a lot of work that was being done to support this GCC project. The GCC, as a sub-regional organization, was kind of a lighting rod for other regional organizations in the region. As you know, other regional organizations in the Arab world have not really functioned well, be it the Arab League, the Maghreb Union, etc., and other integration projects that have failed. The GCC so far has stood the time, stood the test, despite all the different challenges that it has faced. It has protected the region. It has been explained earlier. It has helped to make the Gulf states stand on their feet. And if you go now and see the Gulf, it's an island of prosperity and stability in the very turmoil region. Now, it was also acted as a model for what could be future integration in the region. Most of these projects could have a spillover effect to the regional countries if they succeeded and when they are complete. Also, the wealth that was accumulated in the GCC has been very useful, not only for its own people, but also for the people from the region who come to work and find jobs and opportunities. And there is, of course, remittances that they send back home. The Gulf states, or the GCC states, have also invested in the many regional countries and tried to help them develop. And we've seen, and there was a hope that the GCC states could actually transform the whole region as well as the GCC and make it a much larger, prosperous, and stable region. But things don't always go as planned. And you've all heard about the Arab Spring and the chaos that was created after that. And the GCC states obviously had different opinions about the Arab Spring, so there was like competition between them. Some countries supported the revolutions and the uprising, and other countries were basically counter-revolutionary. Not only they were competing, but they went to the extent that they even had proxy wars, as we see in some areas, especially in Libya. So unfortunately, the Arab Spring brought chaos with it. And of course, any revolution always has a chaos. But it had a very negative effect on how the GCC states work. And that's not to say that the GCC states always had similar views about everything. They've like any regional organization, the European Union as an example, and when it comes to foreign policy, security policy, each country has its own way of doing things, but they're trying to coordinate and cooperate. But you've also heard recently about the Gulf crisis, or what is it called also, the Qatar crisis. And that's another issue that has really hampered the GCC work. As you know, the GCC is based on the principle that they will work and coordinate and cooperate, leading, as John Duke Anthony has just mentioned, to unity. That cooperation, that coordination is achieved through a number of institutions that they have established and a number of policies and strategies that they have done. Of course, they have created something called the Supreme Council, and at that Supreme Council, decisions have to be taken on majority for less substantive issues, and they have to have a unanimous decision for all substantive issues. So you have to remember that point, how decision is taken at the top, at the Supreme Council. They also signed a lot of treaties, and one of the treaties is, of course, the common market. And the common market calls for free flow of goods, people, and capital. And again, this is a very important issue that they have signed. And of course, this has benefited the GCC states. They've also signed a number of security arrangements. They basically became a security community that they don't fear attacks from themselves, and they will, any attack against one country is, of course, an attack against the others. They've also signed a number of other security agreements with international partners, especially the global powers, mainly the United States. Now, what does this Gulf crisis do to the GCC? And this is something that perhaps it hasn't really been discussed much. It is the impact of this Gulf crisis, in my opinion, is going to be devastating because it basically it goes against the treaties that they have signed, which is the free flow of goods, people, and capital. And the decision to do so was taken not at the Supreme Council, where you have to have a unanimous decision. It was taken outside the GCC mechanisms. And with that, one would well ask, what will come of the GCC? The GCC, as you know, is a regional integration project. It's a bloc that was supposed to work together based on treaties. It's a rule-based organization. And if you lose that trust, and if you don't follow the rules that the GCC has established for itself, it becomes defunct. And this is, unfortunately, what is happening now, that the GCC is not functioning as it's supposed to be. Its institutions are almost paralyzed. All the projects that we were hoping and looking forward for their achievements have been delayed, canceled, because they are not even talking to each other because of the current crisis. There is a summit that's supposed to take place in Kuwait in December, and there is a big question mark whether it will take place at all, and this will be the first time in the GCC history. We are really seeing something really challenging to the whole project. And the GCC was supposed to be, on a security issue, a bloc against Iran, for example. But what is happening with this crisis is they're pushing other GCC states against Iran. It's counterintuitive. What are we going to achieve from this crisis? Where is it going to lead the GCC project? Who's benefiting from it? It's not the GCC people. It's not the GCC states. It's not the leaders in the GCC. It seems to me that what is the countries that are benefiting from this are the countries that the GCC were supposed to protect themselves against them. So we're not helping ourselves. But also the GCC has been an organization that has helped and worked with international partners, especially the United States. There are a lot of negotiations that are taking place on the security issue, but also on the free trade negotiations. There is free trade negotiations with the European Union. There's free trade negotiations with China and other countries. And all of this has come to a standstill. So, in my opinion, this is really something that the GCC will have to rethink how it is going to work. In terms of confronting terrorism and radicalization in the region, the GCC states worked with the U.S. In terms of securing the region, the GCC states works with the U.S., and that security cannot be achieved if the GCC states all don't collaborate together. You have to have a collective security for the whole region, and it really hampers the United States and the international coalition efforts against terrorism, and it hampers also the United States efforts against confronting Iran, and it protecting the region. If you have conflict within the house, within your own house, it's going to be very difficult to protect and you allow other people to come in and meddle in your situation. And this is what is happening now. We have seen regional countries taking advantage of this. We've seen the Iranians, of course, are taking advantage of this, but we also seen the Turks as well. We've given them room because of this crisis, but also other international powers who would like to step in. And I don't think Russia is far away from the region, and they do have an interest in having a foothold in the region. So I think time has come that the GCC states leadership think seriously about protecting this regional organization, about protecting this project that the founding fathers have created, leading to more integration and more cooperation and more security and prosperity. And I will save you, Dr. John Duke, the second note. Thank you very much.
Khalid Al-Jabbar is professor of political communication at Qatar University. How I would have loved to have had a course available like that in undergraduate school. So he's pioneering in terms of stretching the envelope, and he's also been involved in editing the largest English language newspaper in his country, the Peninsula, among other things, and he's a National Council International Affairs Fellow.
Thank you, Dr. John. This is all about me. Appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, if we would like to talk about the Gulf region, we need to take a look to big picture in the Middle East and North Africa regions. And if you would like to mark a label for the MENA region, the best description is to see it as a place of manufacturing a crisis, place that producing a crisis after a crisis. The continuing domestic and external crisis clearly appeared after the explosion of so-called the Arab Spring by the end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011. And without doubt, it revealed various changes that reflect the nature of the transition phases and interaction pattern in the Middle East and North Africa region. The questions that has been asked over the past 7 years, and it is still being asked, whether the reason lie on the Arab Spring and its outcomes, or it's in the entirety go to the Arab countries' system and politics and economy and education. Is the problem internal or external, inside or outside? Is it the religion approach, sectarian, secularism, regime or state, the monarchy or the military state? Is it democracy and election or liberalism? Or is not about the political, or open the political door for the new generation, or still reinforcing the wisdom to the elders, or whether letting women drive a car or allowing her to drive the country. The Arab world still remain the lowest rates in the political development and economic growth, and the highest rates of the employment worldwide, particularly among youth and women. In the Middle East, the idea of the state is not dependent on the state of its citizen. It's obvious, responsive to their wishes and needs. Instead, the state and the people in the most Arab world were set against each other. The dilemma drives numerous people, particularly young generation, to seek better future across the border, especially in the Western countries. The lesson of 7 years taught us that the death of the old order does not mean that the old guard is no longer active in the region. On the contrary, dictatorship regime and police state are still the main model of government in the region. Therefore, investing in dictatorship regime from various Western governments will not bring stability, security, or perspective of the region. This is very important to know the big picture before we go and discuss the Gulf region dealing with the whole problem in the Middle East. Because the battle in the Arab world today is no longer about identity and politics. It's not about to label ourselves, we are Islamic or secular. It's about how to govern. It's about giving everyone a fair share of the state resources, about creating a state which protects people rather than prey of its people. It's about functional and fair-minded economy, transparency, and accountable government. If we move to Gulf region, we'll find that the current Gulf crisis is one of the worst crises ever that the Gulf countries have witnesses. There has never been boycott or blockade of the GCC members state at this level in the history of an institutional. The Gulf states were generally characterized as a homogeneous and stable state in the region when compared to the all and other Arab countries. The issue surrounding this crisis is deeper than what appear on the surfaces. The crisis revealed new variables and changing that reflect the transaction across the MENA region that we talk about it in the beginning of this paper, which impacted both its internal and external relation as well. Since the separate of the Arab Spring, the Gulf states have each in their own way attempt to maintain stability in their countries, and thus has translated into a different domestic interest that influenced their foreign policies across the region. The GCC are in the disagreement about key regional issues, such as the war in Syria, the Libya, Yemen, relation with Iraq, Egypt, Tunisia, Turkey, and how to deal with Iranian threats. The crisis revealed major flaws in the GCC as an institution with regard to applying the mechanism in place to resolve dispute and reach compromise among its members. Although Article 4 for GCC state that the objective in the Council is to depend on strength, connection, relation, and cooperation between its people and its various fields, the opposite has happened in this crisis. Unfortunately, the discussion today about the GCC is marked different from yesterday. Rhetoric of unity and the challenge presented by this crisis to the future of GCC are great and profound. Previously, the focus was the cooperation, unity, economy, integration with open market and common currency. Now is changing. There is a better reality of whether the GCC system will still exist in its current form. As the crisis persists without any solution in sight, the feeling of a lost confidence among the member state has increased. Members feel that their sovereignties, including their politics, decision-making process, plus national and international, are being undermined. Some observers begin to discuss whether or not all the 6 GCC countries will remain part of the Council. The current situation is pushing some states also to build a new alliance with a regional or international power, which could have the GCC Union to become merely a symbolic institution similar to the Arab multilateral organization such as the Arab League. This crisis cross-border and has huge implications behind the Gulf region. For example, did not just appear to divide only GCC, but also caused the division in Washington today. Washington turned into literally a GCC proxy war between media, think tank, and other lobbying and politicians. Even the different and government agencies were divided about this crisis. This has created a new paradigm in Washington from viewing the GCC as the unity as before. Its divide GCC also makes it challenging for the US to pursue its regional objective, such as winning the war on terror, realizing that the international community from the United States and European Union, Britain, and even China all are eager to see the GCC crisis resolved. The big question that remains is whether the next Gulf Summit will be held on schedule. Will this crisis further impact what remains of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which lasts for nearly 36 years so far? The latest, but not the last, we can clarify that United States and the Gulf monarchy have a profoundly different views about political order, personal freedom, and gender relation. What links the two is not values, but interest. Those interests are substantial, and they have sustained a productive, beneficial relation for decades. Therefore, there is one of the most important things that Washington needs to keep in mind, which encourage its Gulf allies to put their differences behind them and take a common position supporting regional stability. Thank you all for listening.
Next, Dr. Fahad Nasr, who's a prolific scholar, researcher, writer with numerous publications to his credit. Dr. Nasr.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Anthony, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations for inviting me to speak in front of this august audience. And it's a real honor and pleasure to be among such a distinguished panel. I would like to preface my remarks by stressing that the views I express here today, or any day for that matter, are strictly my own views. I do not speak on behalf of the Saudi embassy or the Saudi government in any way. So I'd like to focus on Saudi Arabia's foreign policy and provide a little bit of context to the policies and the positions it has maintained over the past few years. Like some of my previous colleagues, I agree that the region has witnessed unprecedented violence, political violence, and tumultuous times since 2011. The so-called Arab Spring has proved to be extremely destabilizing. The political order as we know it was upended in 2011, and in many ways the region has yet to fully recover from that disruption. The political and humanitarian crises that have resulted have been very difficult to resolve, not just for the countries of the region and for the people most impacted by it, who are the people living in these countries, but that has also been very difficult for the neighboring countries and for the wider international community. And while many countries have used every means at their disposal to try to resolve some of these political conflicts and to lessen or alleviate the humanitarian suffering, unfortunately, some other actors have used this opportunity and used the political and security vacuum to advance their very narrow self-interests at the expense of the people of the countries, their neighbors, and the stability of the region. And here I'm speaking about non-state actors, militant organizations, terrorist groups, and also some state actors that routinely violate the norms, conventions, and laws of international relations. They do this by interfering in the domestic affairs of other nations and by adopting policies that destabilize other countries and entire regions. Unfortunately, the non-state actors are many, the most infamous of which is the group that I like to call Daesh, or as His Royal Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal, who I believe will be speaking soon, famously called it Fahish, and I think that's a very apt description of that group. The world has watched in horror over the past 3 or 4 years as Daesh has inflicted unspeakable crimes, death, and destruction on the Middle East, on the wider Arab region, across the Islamic world, and also carried some of its brutality to the West, including here in the United States and Europe. And Daesh has also waged war against several countries. There is the perception that it has waged a war against Europe and the United States and the West, and that is partly true, but to be honest, I think that Daesh has really declared a war against all of humanity. It has conducted several terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia, and as I mentioned earlier, Kuwait, Egypt have not been spared either, and it has also inspired attacks here in the United States, Britain, Belgium, and France. Al-Qaeda and its various affiliates, or rather continues to spawn offsprings like a malignant tumor across the region, and they have also brought nothing but death and destruction to the countries in which they have risen. In addition, there are other militant organizations that have also shown complete disregard for the well-being, security, and safety of people in the region and beyond. Here, the two primary examples that I can think of are Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. Unfortunately, it is not only non-state actors that have destabilized the region. As my colleague, Dr. Mohammed, has said, Iran has been the foremost state sponsor of terrorism for decades. It has continued to defy international laws, norms, and conventions by supporting militant groups like Hezbollah in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. And again, at the expense of the countries of Lebanon, Yemen, and any other country where Iran feels that it has the right to interfere in the domestic affairs and by supporting non-state actors. And just a few months ago, I think the U.S. Department of State correctly once again declared that Iran is the foremost state sponsor of terrorism. And while Iran's compliance with the nuclear agreement that it reached with 6 nations over its nuclear activities is a matter of dispute, there's no disputing the fact that Iran, as I mentioned, continues to be a major source of instability in the Arab world, in the wider Muslim world, and across the international community as a whole. And I think President Donald Trump made that very clear when he spoke about Iran last week. So against this foreboding backdrop, you do have Saudi Arabia, which is, as everybody in this room knows, is the birthplace of Islam. It is home to its 2 holiest sites. And because of that fact, Saudi Arabia enjoys a special status in the Muslim world. Saudi Arabia is also the world's biggest exporter of crude oil. It is also the Middle East's largest economy. Because of these facts, I think that there is an expectation in the Arab world and also in the wider Muslim world that Saudi Arabia is best positioned to play a leadership role to help bring some political stability and to meet some of the many economic challenges that confront the Arab world and the wider Muslim world. And I think Saudi Arabia recognizes the position, the unique position that it is in. It realizes that it is indeed blessed to be the custodian of the 2 holy mosques, and it has also been blessed by its oil wealth. Towards that end, it has done everything that it can, used every political, economic tool at its disposal to bring stability and prosperity to the region and beyond. However, Saudi Arabia has always, I think it's important to stress that it has always operated within the confines of international relations and, whenever possible, has sought multilateral solutions and coalitions to resolve these political challenges. So as some of my colleagues have already said, the challenges in the region are many. As far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, the two primary challenges are the ones stemming from non-state actors in the form of Daesh. Saudi Arabia has done everything it can to counter Daesh. It has hunted down its supporters inside Saudi Arabia and beyond. It has foiled many of its plots in Saudi Arabia and beyond, including here in the United States. And it has also discarded and discredited its false narrative on religious grounds. Saudi Arabia has also made it very clear that it will confront Iran's destabilizing policies in the region. And in the latest example, it has expressed its very strong support for the U.S. administration's new strategy on Iran, which does take into account its various nefarious activities in the region and does not draw this rather artificial separation between its nuclear file and its activities in the region. And Dr. Anthony handed me a paper, and I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I handed him a Valentine because I like him so much. No, we were moving along here, and we'll have almost a half an hour for discussion there, which is going to be rich as well. Ambassador Susan Zahra, individual known to many, if not most, in this audience by reputation and name and fame, and from her illustrious family, and having come into the Foreign Service career path a little later than some, but rising to be Deputy Chief of Mission in Riyadh, and then Deputy Assistant Secretary of State most recently, and in between, U.S. Ambassador to the state of Qatar. Ambassador Susan Zahra.
So I have the task of trying to summarize a bit. I didn't have the papers in advance, so I felt like I was back in graduate school taking copious notes, trying to figure out what were the major takeaways from the presentations. I'll try to just mention a few highlights and then try and see if we can put them in a little bit of perspective. And if I misrepresent something, I hope you'll forgive me for the trying to do this in a brief, succinct way. Dr. Mohammed Alsulami talked a lot about the Iran deal, the fact that Saudi Arabia and many of the GCC states, actually so far Saudi Arabia and I believe the UAE, have expressed their concern about Iran's malevolent behavior in the region, concern about missile development, and the fact that our policy as a U.S. cannot be limited to the JCPOA. So this seems to be a major theme. Dr. Abdullah Baabood did a marvelous summary of some of the strengths of the GCC, but again focused on the fact that with tensions in the region right now, not only do the steps that countries have taken act in contravention to treaties that have taken place, but more importantly for us as the United States, it hampers U.S. GCC cooperation, particularly on the issue of Iran and on counterterrorism, which of course affects our homeland. Dr. Khalil Dejaber also was talking about the important role that Washington has to play, and the fact that we have become, in some ways, not the backdrop, but an additional playing field for some of these tensions, and that we, as a government, should be thinking more clearly about ways to bring parties together to look for the unifying elements within the GCC. And then Dr. Nasser, again, emphasize the strength of Saudi Arabia in terms of its size, wealth, its protection of the holy places, and the role that it plays in terms of stability and what I always call is the big brother of the GCC in the region, and the fact that they see their role as the big brother and therefore they're thinking on non-state actors, they're thinking on Iran's destabilizing role in the region certainly often is ascendant. I would just make two comments from my experience, having worked in the GCC. My last job as Deputy Assistant Secretary, I focused for 2 years on that topic at the State Department. Before then, I spent 12 years in my career working in senior jobs in GCC countries. So I think I would point to a couple of things. First of all, these countries, when they did come together, they have different personalities, they have different objectives, they have different criteria for how they see this relationship. There are some countries that believe in you're either with us or against us, and they see things in rather binary terms. There are other countries, and I'll point, for example, Oman, friend to all, enemy to none, and see their role as a very different type of role. But the fact of the matter is that even till today, the GCC has had tremendous cooperation, particularly on the military side, working with us in the Gulf, whether it's the task force that patrol the Persian Gulf and the change of command that has now gone through different GCC countries leading that task force, or the fact that you have different LNOs posted at NAVCENT in Bahrain, or you have the CAOC, the Combined Air Operations Center in El Udeid in Qatar, with elements not only from Western governments, but from all the GCC countries to help us in the United States in terms of our prosecution of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in protection of Gulf waters all the way from Afghanistan through the Horn of Africa up through the Suez Canal. So there is still a lot of cooperation on that level. I would say also that if you look at some of the areas that are economic, the new tax codes that will be coming into the GCC countries, these have all been negotiated within the context of the GCC. They will be implemented at different stages, but it's a common theme and a common way of bringing around reform on economics, where you have countries that have been based on energy sources having to diversify their economies and looking at similar ways to do that. So I think that while we sometimes think that the tensions will outweigh the commonalities, the fact is that these countries have become a bit more muscular than they have been in the past. They are looking at things sometimes in more nationalistic ways that does tint the way they approach things. But there are still common issues that bind them. There are still operational issues where they work together. And it seems to me that we as the United States have the opportunity to continue to focus on those areas and keep those threads and those linkages together in hopes that whatever tensions are taking place right now can dissipate through a common platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Zahra, for an excellent summary on short notice and with no end of difficulty in achieving that feat. Next is Abdulrahman Al-Iriani, who's the Principal Economic and Commercial Officer at the Embassy of Yemen, and who has followed the Yemen civil war and his own country's modernization and development and difficulties and challenges as closely as anyone I have met here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Al-Iriani.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony, for the generous introduction. It seems, well, let me thank the speakers as well for your informative remarks. I think we've covered the political and the security issues hearing our speakers. But I wanted to address more on the emergence of the post-Arab Spring political economy. It brings additional challenges to pre-existing challenges. Challenges mainly are coming now from conflict-affected countries like Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Libya. And this is to add to pre-existing challenges that I've mentioned, low growth of job growth. We are a region with the lowest job growth in the world. And we need to produce at least about 100 million jobs within the next decade. Half of our populations across the Middle East are below 30 years old. In addition to that, we have poverty issues. A third of our populations are in the poverty line. Trading growth issues among our countries in the region, it's slowing down. And productivity in countries in the Middle East is slowing down too. So now the conflict-affected countries have special challenges, and these are mainly to how do they finance their recovery needs. And it is expected that they would need at least about $500 billion within the next 10 years. And plus the cost of unwinding the war economies, the mobilization and disarmament of militias in Yemen and elsewhere, these will cost will incur additional costs. So how does the GCC countries can play a role here? And despite these economic challenges in the region, GCC donors have been playing a critical role for the past 4 decades, funding projects, development projects in Arab and non-Arab countries. And most of their their assistance is usually geared towards funding infrastructural projects. So we now understand that the GCC countries can play a role in this regard, but we need to figure out what are the drivers, what is the catalyst. Is it fear? Is it security concerns? Because this is what we've been hearing in the news recently, or most reports. If you have a collapsed neighbor, it would bring in security issues into your doorstep. Terrorism is another issue. If you have a collapsed economy in the region, this country is prone to fall and to become weak in the face of terrorism. It is a legitimate concern, but it should not be the predominant reason for funding or for initiative to address the economic challenges in the region. There are productivity benefits from having a cohesive and stable regional economy, which unlocks additional productivity for the GCC countries, and especially that the GCC countries are working to diversify their economies. You have a stable neighbor, you have more investment opportunities in that stable neighbor, and it protects, it serves as a protection for the entire Middle East in the face of outside influence. And so to conclude my comment, I'm stealing this from a minister he had mentioned. I kind of heard him speaking at the IMF and the World Bank. He said that our economies individually are small. And we need, therefore, a collective approach to address our economic challenges. And these collective approach and initiatives, they should be built on common interests and shared priorities. And I hope in the discussions to come, I have more to share, but I will keep it in here. I will stop here. But I look forward to hearing more from the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. El-Eriani, and we will have an opportunity. We'll provide you one to elaborate on some of the themes that you just touched the surface on when you introduced them. Let me read some of the questions so that the juices in your respective minds can begin to flow even more pointedly and with a focus. And then I'll take your hands in terms of the ones that you want to respond to there, or you feel more pertinent, relevant, or comfortable responding to. One is, do you see any possible common grounds between Saudi Arabia and Iran to help bring back stability to Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon? And not just limiting it to Saudi Arabia, but any of the GCC countries, including Saudi Arabia. Is one for Drs. Baabood and Al-Jabr regarding the Qatar crisis. How, if at all, do you see a role for His Majesty Sultan Qaboos of Oman, the region's elder statesman and longest ruling leader, to perhaps effectively mediate among the GCC's quote-unquote warring factions? How do you interpret Qatar's behavior after the Arab Spring? This is for Dr. Khalid Al-Jabr. And why, in your view, do you think Qatar decided to sacrifice its relation with the Gulf states? For what purpose? You can take issue with the premise of the question if you like. You can answer it any way you please. Dr. Baabood and Al-Jabr both, as the threats to Arabia seem to expand and diversify, can you be a little more specific as to how you see this possibly affecting the current composition or makeup of the GCC? Another one, taking a broader perspective of the region to include South Asia. Has India and Pakistan come into this at all? They have hundreds of thousands of their nationals in the GCC countries there. And things going on with Hindu nationalism on the rise in India. How, if at all, does that affect the GCC's relationship with those two countries? Is it a distraction? Is it a cause for concern? There's another one on the foreign labor in the development of the GCC countries. Of course, the media has been overwhelmingly critical, and no matter what new rules, regulations, and laws and systems the GCC countries introduced to address this issue, the media criticism does not let up. So in what ways would you describe the existing system, including the reforms, as efficient or reasonably efficient or manageably efficient and equitable? Here's one. To what extent would it have been relatively easy to solve the internal conflict within the GCC if the U.S. had stopped the sale of weapons to them until they had resolved their differences there? There's another one having to do with the degree to which extremist elements inside of Saudi Arabia have exacerbated the rise of extremist organizations such as Daesh or Al-Qaeda. And Lebanon, any further comment on Lebanon's involvement through Hezbollah or otherwise, given the United States engagement with Lebanon, providing it with arms, and if that has deterred Israel? Two more, then I'll stop and let you go at it. Is the GCC a vibrant organization pending the current problems it is facing, or is it in its last and hardly its finest hour? And GCC's involvement in Syria. There are differences between Saudi Arabia and Qatar in their approaches to the situation in Syria. That's enough. Anybody want to raise their hand and go first? Yes, Dr. Alsulami.
Yes, I will talk about the first question, which is Saudi and Iran. In Iran, we have two sides of Iran. We have to We have the government, and we have what they can call the deep state, which is the Revolutionary Guard and the Khamenei office. The government, Rouhani, Zarif, and others, talk about solving the problem with the GCC, with the Arab world, and especially with Saudi Arabia. The problem is that they cannot deliver. They give promises, but they cannot deliver. The other side is, the Revolutionary Guard, we see their behavior in the region. So I don't think they will stop the project they announced since 1979, which is exporting the revolution and constructing what they call the greater state, what the Mahdawi state, which is a sectarian state. Unless, in my opinion, Iran stops its behavior in the region and deliver their promises, there will be no chance, unfortunately, to compromise or find a solution between Iran and the GCC or the Arab countries. What we see in the region now, especially in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, and Bahrain, is a good example of the Iranian project in the region, geopolitics Shias. And unless Iran stops interfering in the internal affairs and domestic affairs of the Arab countries and Saudi Arabian, specific in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, again, we cannot see any light in the end of the tunnels. We hope, but it is on the Iranian side to decide if they want to turn from a revolutionary state to a normal state, to coexist with their neighbor countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if each of you would try to be similarly succinct. We've got time here to get a great deal of information and insight, knowledge, and understanding out here. Next person want to take a stab, and only answer one question at a time, and we'll come back. Yes, Dr. Nazar.
Yeah, if I could just add to what Dr. Mohammed just said. I'm a big believer in the power of goodwill gestures. So when it comes to Iran, a few years ago, Iran has its animosity towards Saudi Arabia is to such an extent that it has even used the Hajj as a time to play politics, which frankly I think offends the sensibilities of certainly all Saudis, but I think also the wider Muslim population around the world. So about 3 years ago, there was a tragic accident at the Hajj. And instead of expressing its condolences to the victims and offering assistance the way most nations around the world did, Iran used that very tragic accident to again play politics and to start making rather absurd calls for the internationalization of the holy mosques, which again, I think that's frankly, as a Saudi, I think that's every Saudi finds that as a non-Saudi and just offensive. So if you play politics, if something as sacred as the right at the Hajj cannot be outside of politics as far as Iran is concerned, unfortunately, it leaves very little room for relations to improve. I just don't see it happening anytime soon.
Thank you for bringing up the aspect of the Hajj. No one else had done so, and you're right to introduce it. It's a complex issue and an inflammatory one as well, whenever it's politicized. Dr. Baabood.
Thank you. When we look at the region around the Gulf states, around the GCC, you can see the whole region is in turmoil. Crisis everywhere. And these Gulf states, the GCC states, are the only island, as I said, or oasis of stability within that turmoil sea. And if you add to it the current economic situation that the GCC states, but also the whole region is facing, that has been mentioned by Riani, due mainly to the fall in oil prices, you can see that the challenges are huge, especially that this is a region that has one of the highest percentage of, terms of childbirth, but also a very, very young population looking for jobs and opportunities. And the last thing you want to see is conflicts in the region, and especially conflicts within the house itself, within the GCC, within the family. That's the last thing you want to see. And I think this kind of conflict came at a really wrong time, when the GCC should be working together, first of all, to protect themselves and to ensure their stability and prosperity, but at the same time, to help the region develop. The question was, will the GCC continue? Will it end up? What is going to be a new dimension? This is something that we really don't know. We have something in the GCC. We call it a politics of kissing the noses. The leaders get together and they kiss their noses and they forget everything and they start all over again. So that might happen. This is the GCC. This is the Middle East. Anything could happen. But if this continues like this, it really doesn't bode well for the regional organization and for all of us in the region. Is there going to be new members of the GCC? I think the GCC has to expand and has to change and has to evolve. This conflict may really give it a chance to evolve. And I think the GCC should not forget Yemen, which we did not talk about this. Yemen has always wanted to be part of the GCC, and now we have failed Yemen, and not only the GCC has failed Yemen, but also the whole international community has failed Yemen. And we are now paying the price for that. And we don't want to get into what happened and how, but Yemen has to be saved and has to be brought into somehow some kind of measures that the GCC states can incorporate Yemen within its region. They cannot be and continue to be just a club for rich people and the monarchies of the Gulf. We need that to expand it to other regions so that the wealth and the prosperity continues. And the very final point, I know you want to stop me, but the very final point, the role of Oman. Oman is, of course, a very active member of the GCC, a country that believes in the GCC and in its integration. Like all other countries in the GCC, it has its different outlooks and different strategic thinking. Can it help? Yes, of course. Oman always likes to play the role of mediation. They've done so in the past, and they will continue to do so in this crisis. However, as you know, His Majesty the Sultan is not very well. His health doesn't help him to do the shuttle travel between the GCC states. So the Kuwaiti leader, who's done and helped in the previous crisis, is doing that, and Oman is supporting that all the way, because the last thing Oman wants to see is a GCC that's becoming defragmented and collapse of this project that's important for everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Baabood. We'll turn to Mr. Al-Iriani from Yemen, and the focus beyond what you've said, looking beyond a settlement of the conflict, how will aid, humanitarian, economic development be sent to, dispersed, distributed within Yemen? Multilaterally, bilaterally, a hybrid between the two? Please elaborate on that, and the kissing of the noses, whether there's likely to be nasal congestion or a free-flowing passageway into the lungs.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony, for your question. So Yemen economic relations with the GCC is strategic. For instance, in Saudi Arabia, we have about 2.5 million migrant workers. There are remittance flow that comes from Saudi Arabia in the amount of in that amount of 2.5 to $3 billion. So we are geared, we positioned ourselves to speak with our neighbors, with our permanent neighbors, We want to capitalize on that strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia and the GCC in general. There are different venues from where we can, channel aid from the GCC. You have the bilateral funds, and you have the regional funds. The bilateral funds, such as the Saudi Fund for Development, Abu Dhabi Fund for Development, and the Kuwait Fund for Economic Development. And for the regional ones, you have the Islamic Development Bank, and the Arab Economic and Social Development. I might be not mentioning it right, but it's based in Kuwait. So for instance, the Islamic Development Bank, we've already initiated discussions, and they've been very helpful. They've initiated a survey, a damage and needs survey, assisting the EU and the World Bank. So the thing is, we should not wait until the conflict ends in Yemen. We need to work in areas that have been stabilized by the government and elsewhere as well. I mean, the government of Yemen is open, of course, for aid to go into across all the countries, whether that is in areas controlled by the government or not controlled by the government. And so we need to capitalize as well on the GCC's donors approach, that they emphasize on donors and recipient dialogue. And they've been using this approach for the past 4 decades. It has aided in making sure that flow of aid is effective. And they've been utilizing the South-South model of aid giving. This has kind of been countering the already pre-existing aid model that has been there from the multilateral organizations. But at the same time, I mean, we need to emphasize that these funds in the GCC are flexible and they're adaptable. And we need to highlight that we share with the GCC, of course, linguistic, cultural, and religious ties. It makes it easier for us to communicate Yemen needs. And the GCC in general upholds as well the counterparties' sovereignty. So it's frank discussions that we have with these donors, and we're very pleased with the productive recent talks that we've had with these funds. So to sum up, I think that these funds can play a strategic role not only in Yemen, but elsewhere in the region too. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was yesterday, or I think this morning, a U.S. Agency for International Development official and representative here. I'd like to see the two of you engage one another in terms of what can you learn from each in terms of past lessons perceived. Ambassador Zahra, are you comfortable coming in here now?
What would you like me to discuss?
Taking any of the questions that were
I
put.
don't mind, but which one specifically?
All right, let's put this one out. People
God,
wonder
why did I
when the crisis will be resolved and whether the parties will get back together. What do you think you're looking at on this dais?
So he saved me the
They are
toughest
together.
question. Yeah,
Okay.
no, they are together. Look, these countries in the region that are part of the GCC, even before the GCC, they are countries that have lived together, groups of people that have lived together as neighbors, their families, their tribes, their relations, their economic development, their investments, crisscross borders all up and down the Gulf. I always joked and said it was so easy living and serving in the Gulf because I never had to learn a new set of names every time I moved from one country to the other because they were the same names. And the fact is that their culture is so similar. They have different personalities. They have different ways of doing things that stems in part from their different populations. There are some differences. Bahrain, for example, with a more heterogeneous population. Oman, of course, is different because of its geography, where it's situated. But at the end of the day, these are countries that have in the past had differences over borders, differences over even economic development. I remember when I was serving in Bahrain, you had a situation where we were negotiating the free trade agreement between the U.S. and Bahrain. And I will tell you that the Saudis were not very happy about that, because for them, this went outside the confines of the GCC and a common tariff. And they did have a perspective on that, I might add. But the fact is that at times, some of these countries and groupings followed their own, what I would call more narrow nationalist interests. So there is a history of that, and it ebbs and it flows, and sometimes it's this neighbor and sometimes it's that neighbor. But I think the common thing that has been stated here is the fact that there are threats in the region, whether it is hegemonic threats from Iran, whether it's counterterrorism, whether it's the fact that even if we've taken Raqqa, ISIS is not dead and could resurrect itself in some other form. Al-Qaeda is still in the Arabian Peninsula, and we're starting to see bits and pieces of it spring up now in Syria. So there are threats that are more reason for common cause and for them to bring themselves together. I think it will eventually get solved. I think each one will have each side and the different sides. They're not just two sides, I might add. We'll have to look at ways that they can maybe amend either their demands or how they're doing things. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's a tenable situation, because now you start seeing outside forces, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, whether it's Turkey, other elements trying to impose their will on the region. And certainly these countries are looking to other alliances, China, the Far East, because those are where their markets are. So it certainly is, I come back to the U.S. national interest. It certainly is in our U.S. national interest to try and bring the parties together and to bring all of our best diplomatic tools to bear to bring this, to ameliorate this crisis and to focus on the unifying elements, economic, military, and security and intelligence.
Thank you, Ambassador Zahra. Now, Dr. Khalid Al-Jaber, your turn.
Regarding to the crisis, I think there is a lot of kissing noises and kissing other things, but definitely the problems has been there for a long time. This is what I believe. Why it's happened today? A lot of issues. The easier way to put it, I think when we are in Washington, the White House is so close. I think the president play a big role with that part. And we can talk about this more after that, if you like to, to talk about it. The crisis, the Gulf crisis, I think we bought a time. I believe this crisis, it could be happen in 2012. After the Arab Spring, we bought time. It's 7 years after it's happening. The GCC, the states, the way that they look to the problems is different now. How we look to the Egypt, for example, now with the regime. Should we invest deeply with them or put a border and respect democracy? How do we deal with Tunisia? Should we go like deeply with some players believe in political Islam as a brotherhood, or we have to support counter-revolution at what we're doing with some GCC country in Libya? What about Syria? What about the war in Yemen now? The coalition and the blacklisted in United Nations. It's a lot of issues we have to deal with. It's not about sacrifice, Qatar sacrifices relationship. This logo, it's hard to sell here. I think it's a lot of problem. We need to sit at GCC countries. We used to do this for 36 years and put priority and discuss it one by one and put a strategy how to deal with this relation between ourselves as a GCC country and the other countries behind us, sorry. Because since we live in the region, there's a lot of failure states surrounding us. Iraq, Yemen, other countries, and our relation with Europe and United States. Deeply inside, I believe this crisis is not gonna be forever. It's gonna take time, but in the end, it's resolved. This is what I believe.
Taking the liberty of the chair here, and we are trying to task our speakers to come up with recommendations for improvement of policies. Here's one. There are various agreements, bilateral thus far, between the United States and each of these countries for access to facilities or defense cooperation agreements, or even to monitor more closely the outward flows of charitable financial contributions from non-state actors to extremist groups elsewhere in the region. The United States has had 3 summits, heads of summits, with these heads of states in the last 4 years. The United States has not had anything remotely like that in United States history. So there's no question about the importance that the American government posits in the globally vital, bilaterally vital composition of this region. And so the United States, let's say today is October the 18th, could say November the 7th, we invite representatives of all 6 countries to further implement the agreements that we have signed together. And we can do so in Kuwait, we can do so in Oman, we can do so at Camp David, and I would venture to say some would immediately say count us in, and let's see who would say sorry and bear the burden of saying no to their partner, which is the world's strongest military, economic, financial, scientific, and technological partner that is tasked to protect them. That, I think, if the 6 would say yes, then they're back together, okay? And all of this, we see our limitations, but the extraordinary expertise and specialization and skills, leadership and otherwise, analytical, scholarly, and making accurate assessments of 6 people up here. And at the end of the day, but also at the beginning and the middle, none of us are bereft of blemish. Not one of us is devoid of defect. And raise your hand if you are free from flaw. Thank you for your attention, and please thank these speakers on this important topic.